Arch Linux, notorious for being the most difficult distro to install, always breaking during updates, and the fanbase being a cult within a cult that serves as a textbook example for narcissism of small differences. Yet, despite all this, Arch is also often regarded as the best Linux distribution, so in this video, I'm going to be installing and trying it out for the very first time with a very specific goal in mind. Daily drive it and see whether or not I can do all my work on it in order to potentially adopt it as my primary operating system. Not only that, but I'm also going to be trying Hyprland, which is said to be the smoothest, best looking, most modern and most hyped tiling window manager, and I'm going to be doing all of this on an Nvidia card, so on paper it should already be doomed from the start. But the reason I'm using Nvidia is simply because it's the most rational choice. I built my computer first and foremost to excel at video editing, and Nvidia cards, especially the 4090, are by far the most performant and optimized when it comes to that. If I were to buy the most powerful AMD card, not only would it be a downgrade in terms of performance, but also features and reliability, especially on Linux in DaVinci as well. And ironically, it seems like the latest top-tier AMD cards aren't always a perfect experience on Linux outside of DaVinci Resolve either. Of course, Nvidia on Linux is far from perfect, though it does work perfectly in the Linux version of DaVinci Resolve, and at the end of the day, I use my computer as a tool, so my priority is always going to be getting work done in the most pragmatic manner, for which the most rational hardware choice is currently going to be either Nvidia or Apple Silicon. And regardless, the Nvidia experience on Linux seems to be constantly improving, especially recently as Wayland support is slowly starting to become close to perfect, and the future outlook seems to be very promising, so I feel like even on Linux, my best, if not only choice, is just to make do with the hardware that I already have. This is also why I want to try Arch Linux, even though like 50% of the comments on my video were telling me to use Arch by the way, so it already makes sense to install it just for the sake of it. My practical reasoning behind it is that since I actually benefit from the most recent hardware and software, it would be best to use a frequently updating rolling release distro, which is exactly what Arch should be. But ironically, that's also the reason why I didn't want to try Arch earlier. I've heard so many times how everything on Arch seems to break during the frequent updates, and I also didn't want to waste time on installing and setting up everything by myself when I could just choose a distro where everything already works straight out of the box. But as is evident from my previous two Linux videos, it's not really that simple. Things did not work straight out of the box, and ironically, I still ended up spending an incredible amount of time on debugging, researching, and fixing various issues, and stuff actually broke during automatic updates, potentially endangering unfinished projects and forcing me to waste even more time in the process. And all of this made me wonder, are things even worse on Arch Linux, or could I actually save time thanks to having more up-to-date software without any constraints or restrictions or built-in customizations that end up doing more harm than good? And I think it's about time to find out, so let's get started. So in order to get started, I decided that rather than looking up video tutorials online, I'd be better off reading the main pages, including the installation instructions, directly from the Arch wiki. Over time, I've discovered that when it comes to learning new software frameworks, even if you hate reading, in the end, it's going to take less effort just to diligently read the official documentation, so you wouldn't have to worry about outdated information or missing out on fundamental knowledge that a random tutorial might fail to cover. The first few articles cover the principles, history, and frequently asked questions related to Arch Linux, and here are some highlights from the ones that I found interesting. Arch is a pragmatic distribution rather than an ideological one. Evidence-based technical analysis and debate are what matter, not politics nor popular opinion. Arch repositories offer open source software for those who prefer it, as well as proprietary software for those who embrace functionality over ideology. This was kind of surprising to read, as I feel like it's a rather bold statement in the Linux world, but at the same time, it felt reassuring considering that even though I do understand the ideology of free and open source software, what I value the most still leads me to see software just as a means to an end for fulfilling certain goals, for which I personally need to use proprietary software, including drivers. While many distros attempt to be user-friendly, Arch remains user-centric, seeking to fulfill the needs of those contributing to it rather than to appeal to as many users as possible. It's also targeted at the proficient Linux user or anyone with a DIY attitude who's willing to read the documentation and solve their own problems. The latter statement is pretty much the exact opposite of what most operating systems, including many Linux distros, would use as their motto. Most of them are promised as time-saving tools that attempt to take care of everything that the end user would otherwise need to unnecessarily spend time on. Needing a DIY attitude, a willingness to read the documentation and to solve your own problems, essentially implies that there are going to be problems, especially if you lack the aforementioned qualities, making it clearly a distro that's more targeted towards hobbyists rather than casual users or professionals. Which also leads us to a question in the FAQ page that reads as follows. Why would I not want to use Arch Linux, with the first answer being, if you don't have the ability, time, or desire for a DIY Linux distro. Now, if the official wiki page of a distro goes out of its way to imply that it's best to stay away if you're limited on time, then indeed, if I wasn't making this video, I'd most likely take the advice and stay away, even if I had the desire. I actually started using Linux already back in 2017, so I could save time by having better compatibility with CUDA, machine, and deep learning frameworks, and already back then, I was very limited on time, so the last thing I wanted to do was spend time on things that I didn't find important, which is why I never had any interest towards trying Arch Linux. That is, until now, so I'm still going into this challenge with a suitable mindset, as I'm curious to see what the vanilla Arch experience is like, and perhaps I can learn something that could help me fix some issues down the line. Though I'll admit that in reality, I'd much prefer to not think about those issues at all, and if given the choice, I'd like to have an ideal environment already pre-configured with the option to customize it later if I so feel like it, which I believe also answers the next question. And finally, you may also not want to use Arch if you're happy with your current OS. Now, I'm not going to talk about Windows or macOS here, so when it comes to Linux, I was actually mostly happy with Fedora, as the main issues I had were more off related to the software I needed to use, rather than the distro itself, except for having to jump through hoops to install proprietary drivers, and the unexpected auto-update that nuked those drivers, as well as DaVinci Resolve in the process. But why would I want to use Arch? Because Arch is the best. And this article might actually be the most interesting one in the entire wiki. While it may seem like a simple joke, I genuinely believe that this quote-unquote meme has been a big driver behind the popularity of Arch and what has given it such a cult-like following, especially recently. A group that appears strong and can confidently say that they are the best is always going to attract more members than a group that stays humble and reserved. This is particularly true for young men who still haven't built a strong identity, making them incredibly impressionable and susceptible to others inserting their own ideology into them, especially if it advertises boastable identity for those who join, while threatening shame and exclusion for those who don't. Why is my internet so slow compared to other operating systems? Is your network configured correctly?
Is your memory card set correctly?
Jumping is not a crime. Why is Arch using all my RAM? Essentially, unused RAM is wasted RAM, and this is something I really wish people understood more. Where did all my free space go? Personally, I use Windows Start on Windows, Grand Perspective on macOS, and disk usage on Android to visualize data usage, and I've benefited so much from those apps. Will I get frequent breakage on Arch Linux? It is the user who is responsible for the stability of their own rolling release system. Arch is truly a DIY distro. Complaints of breakage are misguided and unproductive. And then there's a link to a guide to make your system as stable as possible, which is nice, I suppose. But I can definitely see where they're coming from by saying this, especially since Arch doesn't seem to enable auto updates by default, so surely it can't be that bad, right? But anyway, it's time to finally get started with actually installing Arch Linux.
Okay, let's go.
Okay. Oh no. How do I undo a clear? Okay, I guess we just have to go like this then. What if I type help? Oops. No command found. But next is to set fonts, and since I'm using a 4K monitor, I'm going to try using that. Okay, so set font ter 13db. Okay, I set the font. Next I need to verify the boot mode. Everything seems to be alright. and sure enough, I have internet. Alright, next I need to update the system clock, and it says that in the live environment, if I connect to the internet, the clock should be automatically synced, but it seems to be completely wrong, so... Oh wait, it is synchronized, but just the time zone is mismatched. What if I try set time zone Japan/Tokyo? What if I list the time zones? Okay, so there are a bunch of time zones. What if I grep Japan? Oh, there is Japan. Okay, so all I need to do is just set Japan. Okay, now the time is correct. Next, I need to partition the disks, and this is the most dangerous one because I might... if I mess up, I will be deleting the wrong disk. But I'm sure I'm capable of not doing that, so let's see. Okay, so here are my disks. It also tells me to check that my NVMe drives are using the optimal logical sector size before partitioning. So I guess I can do that. Okay, the one I want to format is the 4TB one, so it is the N1, like me. And it already says relative performance 0 best, so probably everything is already perfectly fine. Okay, now it's time to do the actual partitioning. I'm pretty sure I've already done this on servers though, so it shouldn't be too big of a deal.
20 minutes later.
Okay, I decided to make my life a bit easier, and I completely formatted the 4TB Linux drive that I had in Windows. So I can now start completely fresh from Arch. Okay, since I restarted, I assume everything I did reset, but it shouldn't take too long to redo everything, so... Okay, I managed to create the EFI boot partition, so now I'm going to try to make the root partition, aka where the files actually go. And I more or less now know how it works, so I will do N for a new partition, then choose the default, and the last section I'm also going to choose the default because it's just going to go to the very end of the disk, aka it's going to use up all the disk space that's available. So the partition type was automatically set to Linux file system, but the installation guide has an example layout for GPT that has Linux x86-64 root. I looked it up and it seems that it doesn't make a huge difference, but I'm still going to choose this one just in case because that's what the wiki says. So I'm going to change the type with P. And I'm going to choose the second partition, type alias, so I'm going to list them all. And now I'm going to search for Linux root 86, which seems to be 22. No, it's 23, 86, 64. So I'm going to hit Q to get out of this and type in 23. Okay, perfect. Okay, now I have to format the partitions, and the example is XD4 here for the root partition, so I'm going to run that. Okay, and it's working. Next, I'm going to format the EFI partition, and this is the reason why I decided to just format the disk in Windows instead, like just in case I mess something up. Okay, that was fast. Not sure why it says 31st January of 2021 there, but next I have to mount the root volume to mount and go. Okay, finally partitioning is done. So now it's time to actually install Arch Linux. I gotta select the mirrors, and seems that this thing automatically chooses the optimal ones. You may want to inspect the file. So vim etcpack mirror list. It clearly seems, I'm not sure if this is a Japanese server, but this seems to be a Korean one, and there's an Asian one here, and an Australian one, so this seems to be perfectly set up. So I don't need to do anything here, and instead it's time to install the essential packages. Oh, now it's going to get fun. Use backstrap 8 to install the base package, Linux kernel and firmware for common hardware. Oh boy, we gotta do backstrap K mount base Linux firmware. Okay, I'm installing. So next, the base package does not include all tools from the live installation, so installing more packages may be necessary for a fully functioning base system. To install other packages or package groups, append the names to backstrap command above. I wish you told me that before you showed me this command, but sure. Okay, so since this is CPU related, I assume I only need to install the AMD one, not the Intel one. Do I need this? Do I have to read through all of these? Okay, this is like the first slightly confusing part, I suppose. Wait, what? There is an Archinstall package built into the installer, but the installation guide does not mention it anywhere. I kind of want to try it out, but I'm not really sure if I can use it now, considering I already did many of the steps in the official documentation, but let's see what happens when I type it in. Oh wow, okay. Mirrors, mirror region. Oh hey, they got Estonia, Japan, vocals. Yeah, that's fine. Bootloader. Well, this is the default, so swap. Default, yes. Root password. Very weak. Perfect. User account. Add a user. Liva. Okay, well, it seems to be clearly much easier. Partitioning. Use best effort default partitioning layout. So it's going to be the exact same thing, right? Okay, it already has those things though. Should I create a separate partition for home? I would go with no, but I guess I can gain more experience if I just go with yes. Okay. Disk encryption. Irane. Unified kernel images. No. Host name. Arch Linux. Profile. What profile? Oh, okay. It's like that, I suppose. Install packages. Vim. Yeah, this seems good. Okay. Oh wow, you can choose that? I can even install Hyprland straight from here. This is so easy. Archinstall makes it so easy. Install packages. Dolphin. Ah man, I want Nautilus. Hyprland needs access to your seat. Choose an option to give Hyprland access to your hardware. Boltkit versus CT. I haven't heard either of those. So I guess I can search online. Ah, it's this thing. On i3 I actually had issues where I didn't have those pop-up windows asking for my password when trying to install DaVinci Resolve and stuff, so I had to do it on like KDE. Hyprland suggests Boltkit. Graphics driver. No way! You can even install the Nvidia driver straight from the installer? Man, unbelievable. I might actually only use Arch Linux after this because the installation is so easy. Tweeter. Okay, this is the login menu. Since I'm so used to GDM, I'm going to go with SDDM so I could build more experience. Audio. Okay, now this one of the biggest shortcomings for making videos on Linux right now is that I cannot record audio inside DaVinci Resolve. And if you look at the Pipewire GitLab page, there is an open issue for DaVinci Resolve not recording audio with Pipewire. The only workaround is to use Pulse Audio ALSA, but Pipewire seems to be the default on modern Linux distros. So by switching to Pulse Audio, I'm not sure what kind of issues I'm going to run into, but I guess I'll go with that for now. So next, there's additional packages. I'm just going to put Firefox here. Network configuration. I guess I'm going to use Network Manager. Alright, time zone. This is just going to be Japan. And that seems to be it. So I'm going to hit install. And it seems to be installing. Oh! It seems that it worked, and Jesus, this looks ugly. Hyprland. So let's see if I can log in and what's gonna happen. Okay. Oh, okay. Hyprland is not properly configured for Nvidia. Everything seems to be building. Okay, I gotta restart my computer now. Whoops. Okay, so after changing the Nvidia compatibility parameters for Hyprland and rebooting my PC, my Archinstall was apparently corrupt. When I tried googling it, there were literally only 2 results with the exact same error message, and neither of them gave me a direct solution, but eventually I decided to boot into the live USB environment again and run the compile command once more, which indicated that something on my file system had become read-only. But now when I restarted my PC, my Archinstall suddenly worked again, and I feel like there are 2 possible explanations behind this. One is that after my PC rebooted to Windows, it didn't properly shut down at first and made a part of the disk read-only, even though it's on a completely different drive. And the other explanation is that something was fixed after rerunning the compile command, even though it didn't even finish. But regardless, I was finally able to boot into Hyprland, and the first thing I did was install OBS with Pacman so I could record my screen. And despite using Arch, Nvidia, Wayland and Hyprland, OBS worked straight out of the box, and it even picked up my microphone with no problems. This was also my first experience with Hyprland, and it already looked pretty okay straight out of the box, and the promised animations were indeed very smooth and definitely added a level of polish that was nice to see. I then started doing some basic configuration, and I discovered that setting up things such as monitors was surprisingly simple, and overall the documentation was easy to understand and even provided multiple suggestions for additional software that you'd want to install, such as panels. Personally, I went with this revolutionary practical bottom panel design, but other than that, the configuration I did was extremely minimal, because rather than spending days on setting up the perfect environment, I wanted to see if the software I need to use is actually going to work, so I started installing DaVinci Resolve. Now, the thing about Arch Linux is that it has a lot of packages which you can install and two sources for installing them, with the main one being the official repositories that you can install with Pacman, and the other being Arch user repositories maintained by the Arch community that you either need EA or Paru for. And installing DaVinci on Arch should actually be very easy because the R repository already has packages for it, but turned out that the latest package is broken and has been for quite a while. The comments said that it works if you comment out a certain line in the package build script and then install it from there, but regardless, that package was for Resolve 18.6, but I want to use the latest beta version because it includes various bug fixes and improvements that I benefit from. However, the R package for the beta version was incredibly outdated, so I decided to just download Resolve directly from Blackmagic's website. But of course, installing it obviously didn't work right away, so after performing fixes and installing packages for each of the errors I encountered, Resolve finally launched, but it got stuck on the loading screen. At this point, I was kind of stumped on what to do next, because I had only just begun and I already discovered that I cannot use this setup whatsoever. But lo and behold, a few hours later, Resolve suddenly started working without me even doing anything, but long story short, Resolve started once again getting randomly stuck on the loading project screen in the exact same fashion as it did in Fedora in my last video, and my biggest suspicion was that it has something to do with Wayland, because even though I ran into the same issue on X11, that always occurred after it had started happening on Wayland. And this unfortunately also meant that Wayland as well as Hyprland were both going to be unusable for me. Though I actually did have other issues on Hyprland as well. Even though it was generally very smooth, I often got these sudden performance dips in browsers and such, and I also discovered that I can't drag and drop files under certain conditions, for example from Nautilus to DaVinci Resolve, which is an action I need to perform hundreds of times when making videos. Turns out that this is an issue in Hyprland that probably won't be fixed anytime soon, and even though OBS did work straight out of the box, I discovered that many of the recordings I took were randomly frozen midway through the clip, and generally OBS seemed to work a bit unreliably, which is obviously completely unacceptable for me. So, combined with the DaVinci Wayland issue, I decided that I won't waste any additional time on researching these problems and just move on to X11. At first, I decided to try out Qtile, but that adventure came to an end pretty much instantly as soon as I discovered that you cannot drag resized tiled windows, so once again I swiftly moved on, and this time to a desktop environment known as Cinnamon. Essentially, I was feeling a bit nostalgic as I actually used Linux Mint with Cinnamon in the office for years, and I remember feeling pretty sympathetic towards it, other than certain nitpicks I had about its visual design, and honestly, when I tried it again, it was pretty okay. I mean, it wasn't perfect, and it already looked outdated 10 years ago, but the true deal breaker was that I had those X11 graphical glitches even on Arch Linux, so Cinnamon was out of the question as well, which once again brought me back to i3. But this time I tried something different. I combined the Xfce desktop environment with i3, meaning that I now had the exact same i3 setup as before, running inside an actual, fully functioning desktop environment that took care of all the small things that I either hadn't set up yet or didn't want to deal with. Now I had access to convenient features such as quick display settings, power management, default applications, theming, authentication and so on, that otherwise I'd need to set up all by myself and constantly configure via text files. I also had this issue where my monitors didn't want to wake up from sleep or when I switched the monitor input source, but thanks to the Arch wiki I was able to find a fix and now it works most of the time. I also decided to take inspiration from my revolutionary bottom panel on Hyprland and switch out Polybar for Theme 2 with a custom configuration, and even though it's not perfect and a bit buggy, I do find it a bit more practical. Overall, I'm pretty happy with this i3 plus Xfce setup, though I do wish that some of the theming was a bit more modern and that i3 had features such as native dynamic tiling, but that will most likely never happen, so eventually I'll have to switch to a different tiler. There are of course other small imperfections here and there as well, but one of my biggest complaints is still the occasional background flashing issue caused by running Picom. There is an open issue about it, and the only workaround seems to be a hack that creates an artificial 50 millisecond delay between switching workspaces, which does get rid of the flashing, but the input delay it causes is kinda nauseating, and after enabling it, my code editors and such started getting very sluggish for some reason. If I disable Picom, I'm occasionally met with the X11 graphical glitches again, so it seems like the only real solution that's going to fix everything from that issue to screen tearing is just going to be using Wayland, but if I do that, I'm going to have issues with OBS and DaVinci Resolve right now. But anyway, to change the topic a bit, there is something which I didn't mention in the previous video at all, which is gaming, but I actually did try a bit of gaming on the Fedora 39 setup at the end of 2023. The first game I tried was CS 1.6, which worked perfectly fine even on i3, though for whatever reason it did default to my secondary vertical monitor at first. I also joined a server and had a trip down memory lane by playing some Fee Pool Day, and at first the server had just one player until it eventually got completely filled up, and it made me reminisce on how back in the day, that's exactly how it used to be. Most online gaming happened in small, community-hosted servers like this with no actual competitive modes or grinding for ranks, except for that one guy that panic spammed /rank every time he died or got a kill. I also tried League of Legends by emulating it to Lutris, and it actually ran perfectly, except on i3, where for whatever reason it kept freezing every minute or so, and I discovered that all I had to do to unfreeze it was just hit the Windows key, which eventually became muscle memory. But keep in mind that this was in 2023 though, because since then, Riot implemented a kernel-level anti-cheat for League, except for macOS, so League on Linux is now completely non-existent. Recently though, I actually haven't done pretty much any gaming for months, but for the sake of this series, I did try an older game known as Tomb Raider 2 on Nobara 39, and it once again worked perfectly, dare I say even better than on Windows 11, where it had some weird issues with the title bar and resolutions, none of which were a problem on Nobara, though tabbing out of the game bugged it out every single time, which seems to be a known issue. However, when I tried it again on Fedora 40 and now Arch, the game was very laggy and exiting to the menu had some graphical bugs, probably meaning that the customizations built into Nobara solved those issues straight out of the box, but unfortunately, if I wanted to play the game on Arch or on other distros, I'd have to spend hours on researching how to fix it. I also wanted to try a natively supported Linux game called Night in the Woods that I bought years ago for learning Japanese, but of course never got around to playing. The English version of the game launched without issues, but the Japanese version didn't, which is unfortunate considering that it has one of the best Japanese localizations out of any Western video game, and learning Japanese from it was my original objective. So now I had a choice. Am I going to use that scarce 1 hour of free time that I found on researching on how to get the game working despite there being no guarantee of success, or am I just going to instead run it on Windows or give up completely? Well, I'll just say that when I was around 9 years old, I already used to spend hours on pirating video editing software as well as games, and I tried getting them working on absolutely horrible hardware, despite being barely able to understand English, but I've reached a point in my life where I'd actually rather pay for most software, already because the time and energy I'd waste on pirating them will cost me more than if I were to just buy them. So my choice was to consciously stop myself from trying to get the games working after it started taking me more than 10 minutes, because this is just not a fulfilling use of my limited free time. I'd rather put that same hour into making a game myself than trying to fix a game that I paid for and could play without issues on other platforms. Though I did discover that when I forced Night in the Woods to use Proton instead of the native Linux version, then even the Japanese version works, but it had really bad screen tearing, at least on X11, so I just gave up considering the amount of yak shaving I had already done throughout this entire challenge. But anyway, eventually it was once again time to see if I can properly use DaVinci Resolve on Arch, but this time on X11 instead. So I tried recording audio in the Fairlight page running Pulse Audio Alsa, and it actually worked. But this is what it sounded like. So this is what it sounds like right now. Essentially, the audio constantly crackled, and this issue was also mentioned in the GitLab page that I talked about earlier, so I still haven't found any proof of audio recording properly working in DaVinci Resolve 18.6 or newer in Linux. I even went as far as to reinstall the official DaVinci Resolve Rocky distro again on a separate drive, but when I tried recording audio there, Resolve just acted weird and then crashed. But just as I thought, at least Resolve did not get stuck on the loading project screen on X11, but the same issue was still happening because sometimes the loading projects part started taking around a minute instead of a few seconds, and when it was finally done with loading, I had no audio whatsoever in DaVinci, even if it worked last session. So even though my original plan was to make this video entirely in Arch Linux, unfortunately, DaVinci Resolve is currently way too unreliable for that to be a reasonable idea, and I cannot justify spending any more time or energy on trying to find solutions to these issues, as I'm not even sure if proper solutions exist. I even tried methods such as DaVinci Box and running Rocky in DistroBox, but even those had issues, and overall it's just a much bigger hassle than just having it work natively. It's especially vexing considering that even if I get Resolve reliably working, I'd still have to use workarounds for limitations such as no audio recording, no AAC audio, no auto hotkey, no native Photoshop, and so on, all of which add additional burden and time cost to every video I'd make. And since every additional hurdle causes additional fatigue, there is a high chance that said hurdles will also lead to lower quality work in the end. Every hour I'd need to needlessly sacrifice on overcoming problems that I otherwise wouldn't even have to deal with is an hour that I could have put into doing the work itself, towards other ambitions that I find more fulfilling, resting, or off the computer, and outside. Moreover, due to the nature of my job and interests, I already know that I'll have to spend the majority of my life on the computer whether I like it or not, so I really have to weigh my options and ask myself whether or not the risk of potentially making the situation even worse is going to be worth it. But considering the current state of professional video editing on Linux, I don't even have a choice. Daily driving Linux is just not a viable option for me, at least for the time being. I'm also not exactly sure when it will be, because obviously the only one that can do something about it is going to be Blackmagic Design, perhaps by turning DaVinci Resolve into a flatpak or whatnot, but it's rather unlikely that that's going to happen anytime soon. But anyway, I haven't really given up on Linux completely. I'll most likely keep my Archinstall around for software development, as well as to occasionally check whether or not things have improved. And something I'm especially looking forward to is Cosmic, which is a brand new, fully fledged desktop environment that natively supports both tiling and floating based window management paradigms, which is pretty much exactly what I want. It's also going to be very smooth because it's running Wayland, and they've officially stated that they will be supporting Nvidia cards. However, since the alpha version literally just released, I assume that it's going to take at least a few years before it's actually stable and usable, but when that happens, I can imagine it potentially becoming the only desktop environment I'd use on Linux. I actually already tried it out, and one of the reasons why it was so easy for me to install was because I was using Arch Linux, through which I had access to the latest bleeding edge packages. The package manager on Arch definitely gives the user a lot of freedom in terms of installing both free and proprietary software, so it never got in my way, and there were packages for almost everything I wanted to install, as even the more obscure applications usually had some level of Arch support, and the newest versions of packages became available really quickly, though not always immediately. For example, I wasn't able to use Discord after it released an update because the Arch package for Discord wasn't updated for over a week, so I just ended up using the Flatpak version instead. Sometimes certain R packages also fail to install, for example, Resolve from earlier, a program called Input Mapper, and even Anki, which I also just ended up installing as a Flatpak. I've also heard that relying on R packages is a bad idea in terms of reliability, especially if they become outdated, and I use Timeshift for backups just in case something goes wrong. Overall, Arch was pretty much exactly what it promised to be. A do-it-yourself distribution, so on a fresh, minimal install, it did take quite a while before I got everything set up, which in a way was pretty interesting, but if I'd ever want to reinstall my system for whatever reason, having to once again set up literally everything from Bluetooth to firewalls to Android file transfer, video file thumbnail generation and so on is just something that I wouldn't want to waste my time on. So perhaps EndeavourOS would be more fitting for me, as it's often described as Arch without the time waste, but to be honest, I don't feel like I absolutely must use an Arch-based distro. Just as I expected, using Arch didn't solve even a single issue I had, and while the Arch repositories are great and all, at the end of the day, they aren't really game-changing for me, and considering how much I value reliability and not being forced to waste time on random issues, I might as well just use Fedora for additional stability, while still staying relatively close to the bleeding edge. But regardless, the distro doesn't really matter as long as I can't properly and reliably use the software I need to use, which is why, for the time being, this is where my Linux adventure once again comes to a halt.